In today's Nonsense Wars production, we look at a model that I did not think I would rebuild. In the late 1920s, the DRG, the German National Railways, built a pair of similar but not identical steam turbine locomotives, the T18.1001 and 1002. These experimental units proved successful enough to remain in service, but not successful enough to justify further production. Both units suffered bomb damage during World War II and were subsequently withdrawn. I built my original 1:48 scale model of the 1001 in 2013 after the ACE and the 5AT. Like the 5AT, it did not last long, as I wanted to focus on American trains and I did not want to build out British or German rolling stock. Almost 10 years later, this model had become the most viewed listing on our Rebrickable, which prompted me to design an updated version with modern parts and a motorized drivetrain. Like the ACE and the 5AT, my first T18 relied on an external power car for propulsion. Therefore, it featured a highly articulated low-friction chassis which split the driving wheels and joined them with bevel gears. This coupling mechanism, also used on the ACE, synergized well because the turbine output acts as a fourth wheel. With the rebuild, I wanted to see if this mechanism would stay in sync if it had to transmit power. At the very least, the link between the center bogies would need some work. This beam carries a bevel gear and keeps all the gears aligned. I previously built it with old Technic perpendicular joiners with studs on the sides. I could hold these together with plates, which could also support greebles. Making a similarly strong assembly with contemporary parts proved challenging, and I had to split the structural components from the aesthetic components. A power functions or powered up motor definitely would not fit in the 4-wide boiler, so it had to go in the cab and drive the 5th axle. I moved the rear pivot over the same axle to avoid the drivetrain shenanigans seen in the QJ. I relocated the expansion joint from the back to the front, though the connection to the boiler feels a little bit sketchy. The 6th axle, which uses size 7 wheels, no longer connects to the body and simply floats on a hinge. I wanted to reuse as much of the original model as possible, like I did with the 5AT remake. Unfortunately, the original model used enough old parts such that I ended up redoing maybe 60 to 80% while keeping the overall dimensions, though I actually question their accuracy. Many German locomotives scale to 8 wide in 1:48, but I made this one 7 wide except for the awkwardly wider rear axle greebles. The engine nonetheless looks more or less the same as before, though I do think I improved the rounded conical nose quite a bit, again like I did with the 5AT. I did have to compromise on the motorization, Usually I try to make drivetrains and motors easily accessible, but I could not find a way to manage this on the T18. I also don't like the fragility of some drivetrain and chassis components. I tried to test this a lot, especially on R40 curves with relatively heavy loads. At a recent Baylug meeting, a prototype pulled 3 bearing axle cars for about an hour without the connecting rods desynchronizing, though I did have to double up on the front and rear bevels. The gears feel more likely to come apart when moving the engine through the air rather than running it on the rails, as with the Ace. I did encounter a minor issue with the turbine output. The already naked pins could still strike the front wheels in an R40 turn. The original model might not have had this issue, as the chassis may have exhibited slightly different dynamics when pushed instead of driven. I fixed this by limiting the pivot of the front axle. The frame will strike the gears spacing the aforementioned pins before the pins themselves strike the front wheels. I also modified the tender to fit a battery box. Accommodating the fence grates and the half-stud offset proved almost as challenging as rebuilding the entire locomotive. I unfortunately had to make a not prototypical change. I lowered part of the shoulder to reinforce the bottom of the narrower section with parts that did not interfere with the battery box. I also made some minor changes to the greebles on the bogies. While I could not make the locomotive come apart easily to access the drivetrain, I could make the tender come apart easily in order to access the battery box. Unfortunately, that does not make it any easier to connect and manage the cable, which can get caught on the cab in turns if not routed properly. The 4.5 stud long drawbar between the engine and the tender only pins on one side to facilitate decoupling. The 420-gram locomotive pulls about 100 grams, apparently typical for an engine of this weight with not enough driven axles. See either of the D2s or even the X10A. Putting tires on the fourth axle might help a bit, but I would not consider putting tires on the third axle, as the bevel gear train will come apart under enough load. Mild slipping seems okay, such as in the case of pulling 2 P85s around an R40 loop. I updated and validated this model in part to make instructions for the rebrickable posts, which I have linked in the video description. I hope to do the same with a couple more older mocks, so stay tuned for those videos. I probably won't keep the T18 around for too long, but on that note, this is the end of the video, so have a nice day.